Today it is necessary to stop the hysteria, abandon the Cold War rhetoric, and recognize something obvious. Russia is an independent and active participant in international affairs. It, like other countries, has national interests that need to be considered and respected. I'm also addressing Ukrainians. I sincerely want you to understand us. In no way do we want to harm you or offend your national feelings. We have always respected the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state. Crimea is our common heritage and a crucial factor of stability in the region. And this strategic territory must be under strong and stable sovereignty, which in fact can only be Russian today. The referendum was held openly and honestly, and the people in Crimea clearly and convincingly expressed their will. They want to be with Russia. Today, based on the results of the referendum that took place in Crimea, relying on the will of the people, I submit to the Federal Assembly and ask that it consider the constitutional law on the acceptance of two new subjects into the Russian Federation: the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. I have no doubt that I will have your support.
March 18, 2014, Putin addressed the Russian Federal Parliament. Vladimir Putin. Right after annexing Crimea, without firing a single shot. But before I continue, let me ask, a strategic territory could only be under strong and stable sovereignty. And that, in fact, it can only belong to Russia. At that moment, Putin seemed to have every reason in the world to be confident. After all, the operation had been an absolute success. Within a matter of weeks, Russia had taken control of the most strategic position in the Black Sea, and the rest of the world even protested, but they didn't do much, just a few sanctions. And you know what's even more interesting? If Putin could see at that moment what's happening in Crimea today, I'm almost sure he wouldn't have given that speech with so much conviction, because 10 years later, something is happening on the peninsula that completely defies all the predictions we've heard so far. What I'm going to show you in the next few minutes might forever change the way you see this conflict. First, I need to show you why Crimea became so important, and why Putin was so confident on that March day. Look, Crimea is not just a piece of land. It is literally the center of gravity of this entire war. Whoever controls Crimea controls the Black Sea. And whoever controls the Black Sea has a huge advantage over Ukraine. Think of it this way. Before the war, 70% of all Ukrainian exports went through the Black Sea. That includes 90% of the country's agricultural exports. Putin's plan was simple: to use Crimea as a base to block those ports and strangle the Ukrainian economy. In addition, the peninsula served as a gigantic logistical hub. It was from there that Russia launched its offensive in southern Ukraine in 2022. Soldiers and equipment arrived in Crimea from Russia and were then distributed to the front. But then the first big problem appeared that disrupted Putin's plans, and you'll understand why this is crucial in a moment. Back to Crimea, there's another point that made it vulnerable: its geography. And it's interesting how sometimes Putin's decisions end up backfiring on him. That's because the peninsula depends on just a few connections to the outside world. And do you know which is the main one? The famous Kerch Bridge, which Putin built as a symbol of his annexation. Now, Imagine that you are a military commander and you need to defend an outpost that depends on just a few bridges and canals to receive water, food, and ammunition. It doesn't sound like a good idea, right? But hold on, this is just the beginning. While everyone thought that Ukraine would never be able to challenge Russian naval power, something completely unexpected started to happen in the Black Sea. In February 2022, right after Putin launched his invasion, it was quite clear that there was a huge naval disparity between the two countries. The Russian Black Sea Fleet had about 25,000 military personnel and dozens of large warships. The Ukrainian Navy, on the other hand, had only a few dozen patrol boats. Any military analyst looking at this would agree that Ukraine didn't stand a chance at sea. But this is where things get really interesting. Ukraine didn't try to fight a conventional naval war. Instead, it did something that completely changed the rules of the game. Using missiles like the Neptune, made in Ukraine itself, and a growing fleet of sophisticated maritime drones, Ukraine began a systematic campaign to destroy the Russian fleet. The first major success came in April of that same year, when a Neptune missile sank the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian fleet. But that was just the beginning. The Ukrainians developed maritime drones like the Magura and the Sea Baby, which began to cause impressive damage. And there's something surprising about these drones. They evolved incredibly fast. They went from being simple kamikaze boats to becoming multifunctional platforms. In fact, Ukraine managed to do something that had never been done before in the history of naval warfare. They equipped maritime drones with air-to-air missiles, which made all the difference for them to be able to shoot down Russian fighter jets, such as the Su-30. That's exactly what you heard. Maritime drones shooting down fighter jets. An unprecedented feat in history. And do you want to know the result of this campaign? Ukraine achieved what for many was considered impossible. They destroyed or damaged 26 ships of the Black Sea Fleet. This includes crucial landing ships, corvettes, patrol ships, and even a submarine. But here comes the most interesting part of this story. Something that most people don't know. When Turkey closed the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits at the beginning of the war, it created a perfect trap for the Russian fleet. Because of a treaty called the Montreux Convention, which has existed since 1936, Turkey holds control over these vital straits. And when it recognized the conflict as a war, it simply closed the passage to military ships. And this created yet another big problem for Russia, because every Russian ship that Ukraine destroys in the Black Sea cannot be replaced. Russia simply can't bring naval reinforcements from its other fleets. It's as if the Black Sea Fleet is trapped in a basin, being attacked by an enemy it can't effectively reach. And that was the recipe for Russian disaster. In July 2024, Putin was forced to do something humiliating: withdraw what was left of his fleet from the historic port of Sevastopol in Crimea. The ships were then moved to ports further east, a place considered safer for them. With the Russian fleet neutralized, Ukraine was able to move on to the second phase of its strategy. And that phase did not involve conquering Crimea by force. Instead, it decided to do something much smarter: to turn the peninsula into a prison in the shape of an island. The main target of this strategy is obvious. Say all. Basti Duff, the Kerch Bridge. This 18-kilometer structure is not just a physical connection between Crimea and Russia. It is the ultimate symbol of Putin's annexation. And since then, the Ukrainian campaign against the bridge has been persistent and increasingly sophisticated. The first attack happened in October 2022, when a truck bomb caused sections of the road to collapse and set the railway deck on fire. The following year, in July, Sea-Baby naval drones hit the bridge again. But the most impressive attack happened in June 2025, when the Security Service of Ukraine carried out a complex operation using underwater mines. For several months, they placed the equivalent of 1,100 kilograms of trinitrotoluene against the underwater pillars of the bridge. The explosion was so powerful that, according to intelligence reports, it left the structure in a critical state. And as you can imagine, each of these attacks forces closures, disrupts supply chains, and creates a constant state of military and psychological pressure. In addition, this constant threat forces Russia to divert scarce air defense systems to protect a single target. But the bridge is not Russia's only logistical problem in Crimea. Remember when I mentioned how Putin's decisions sometimes backfired on him? Here's a perfect example of that. In June 2023, Russian forces destroyed the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine to try to stop a Ukrainian counteroffensive. The problem is that this dam supplied the North Crimean Canal, which historically provided 85% of the drinking and irrigation water for the peninsula. With the destruction of the dam, Crimea plunged into a severe water crisis. Already this year, the situation reached a critical level. The local reservoirs lost millions of cubic meters of water and are operating at only 50% capacity. Local experts warned of an acute water crisis since the Dnipro River, which historically supplied the canal through the dam, was now cut off. This shortage doesn't just affect the population, it also directly impacts the sustainability of the Russian military presence, which consumes large amounts of water. And there's another crucial point here. The fortifications that Russia built in Crimea were designed to defend against ground attacks, not to solve a water crisis or prevent long-range missiles from hitting infrastructure in the rear. The Ukrainian strategy didn't stop there. In fact, everything you just heard is only the preparation for the most devastating element of this entire plan. That's because Ukraine understood something fundamental. They didn't need to conquer Crimea if they could make it an unsustainable financial burden for Russia. And the numbers you're about to hear now show why this is working. Look, when Putin launched his invasion, Russia had financial reserves that seemed solid. The National Wealth Fund had $175 billion. It seemed like enough money to sustain a long war. But the reality now is turning out to be quite different. The cost of the war is draining Russian coffers at an alarming rate. The Russian defense budget has almost tripled since 2021. And there is evidence that the real cost is almost double the official numbers. The reason is simple. The Russian government forces banks to give loans to defense companies. To understand the size of the problem, we need to talk about Russia's National Wealth Fund. Think of it as the country's emergency savings, made up mainly of money from oil and gas sales. This is the reserve that the government uses in times of crisis or to finance important projects. Well, this fund plummeted from $175 billion to just $38 billion. But wait, it can still worsen. What is really breaking the back of the Russian economy is the human cost of the war. By mid-2025, Russian casualties had surpassed the 1 million mark, including those killed, wounded, and captured. To keep the flow of soldiers, the Kremlin is offering a kind of bonus that can reach $30,000 or $40,000, in addition to high monthly salaries. and the government has committed to paying substantial compensation to the families of fallen soldiers. This creates a growing long-term financial liability. Now, add all that to the cost of replacing thousands of destroyed tanks and equipment, and you'll understand why Russia is rapidly heading toward economic exhaustion. According to Ukrainian intelligence analysis, by the end of this year, Russia is expected to face major financial problems, labor shortages, and a crisis in public services. And this is where the Ukrainian strategy becomes brilliant. With Crimea isolated by sea, logistically strangled, and increasingly expensive to maintain, the peninsula is turning from a strategic asset into a financial liability. I know that after hearing all this, you might be wondering, okay, but where is this going to end? And look, based on the sum of all these factors, there are 3 scenarios that are considered the most likely for the future of Crimea. The first is economic collapse. In this scenario, the combination of naval isolation, logistical strangulation, and economic exhaustion pushes the Russian economy to the breaking point. Unable to continue funding the war and the costly occupation of Crimea, Putin would be forced to negotiate from a very unfavorable position. The second scenario is internal collapse. The prolonged siege would create such precarious living conditions within Crimea itself that Russian support would completely collapse. This could lead to civil unrest or the collapse of the occupation administration from within. The third scenario is a military turning point. In this scenario, the continued degradation of Russian forces would reach a point where the defenses would effectively break down. And in this way, a final and limited Ukrainian operation would become feasible with minimal human cost. And what makes this strategy so smart is that it avoids the greatest risk of all, nuclear escalation. Instead of a sudden attack, which could provoke a drastic reaction, Ukraine is slowly suffocating the peninsula. Stop and think. This forces Putin to consider using nuclear weapons, not because Ukraine is invading Crimea with tanks and soldiers, but because the peninsula is running out of water and money is running out. How do you justify a nuclear war because of supply problems? It's a much more complicated decision to make. The reality of Crimea is different now. What everyone said was impossible is becoming a real possibility. Not through a direct attack, but through a strategy that gradually erodes Russian defenses from within. Ukraine has achieved naval dominance without having a navy. It is turning a fortress into a logistical prison in the shape of an island. And it is accelerating the economic exhaustion of its aggressor. The question is no longer whether Russian control over Crimea can be broken, but when all this pressure will become too much for Russia to bear. And you, what do you think about it? Which of the 3 scenarios do you think is most likely? Economic collapse, internal collapse in Crimea, or a military turning point? Leave your opinion in the comments. If this video changed your perspective on the conflict, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing it with someone who is interested in geopolitics. This helps me a lot to keep bringing analyses like this. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.